50 years ago, 4 out of 5 people in China worked in the fields, and more than 96% of the population lived in poverty. Today, China produces nearly 1/3 of all goods on Earth. It wages trade wars. It competes in the space race with Russia and the United States. And all of this has happened under the rule of the Communist Party, without broad democratic reforms. So how did China, in just 30 years, overtake nations that once seemed impossible to catch? To answer that, we must travel through history, into the story of how one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations is reclaiming its global influence. On a map of ancient civilizations, the earliest known society, Mesopotamia, appeared about 6,000 years ago in what is now Iraq. 1,000 years later, the Indus Valley civilization emerged in present-day Pakistan, and in North Africa, Egypt's pharaohs built monumental tombs. Most of these civilizations disappeared. Only one of the youngest, China, born 4,000 years ago, still exists today and now challenges the world's economic leadership. But ancient China was not a single state. It was a collection of rival kingdoms, united only in 221 BC by the first emperor, guarded even in death by his famous terracotta army. From then on, China expanded, traded across Asia, and helped create the Silk Road. Chinese silk, tea, and porcelain reached as far as the Roman Empire. Yet China fiercely protected its secrets. Foreigners were restricted, technology was guarded, and even the secret of silk reached Europe only through espionage ordered by Byzantine Emperor Justinian I. Geography protected China as well. The towering Himalayas to the west, the vast Gobi Desert to the north, and dense jungles to the south. This isolation created a natural monopoly on valuable goods and shaped a powerful idea that China was the center of the civilized world and everything beyond it was chaotic and barbaric. For centuries, China needed little from outsiders. It traded only for silver, much of it mined in the Americas, in regions that are now Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia. With fertile land and a massive population, China remained stable and self-sufficient. By the early 19th century, it accounted for nearly a quarter of the world's economy. But stability came at a cost. Isolation slowed innovation. Population growth consumed economic gains. Meanwhile, nations of Western Europe competed fiercely, accelerating technology, industry, and trade. Even gunpowder, invented in China for fireworks, became a weapon that reshaped history. The leader of this transformation was Great Britain, which launched mass production, powered the Industrial Revolution, and eventually forced China into economic decline. In the early 15th century, European explorers heard rumors of a great Eastern Empire. In 1508, Portugal's king, Manuel I, ordered his travelers to learn everything they could about the mysterious land called China. And just as Europeans knew almost nothing about China then, the modern world would soon discover how quickly that ancient empire could rise again.
Nearly 85% of the population of China still lived in villages and worked the land. In England, however, this reality ended much earlier. The Industrial Revolution transformed society. People moved to cities, factories replaced farms, and industry began to reshape the world. Powered by technological progress, Great Britain not only built a global empire, it also needed new markets for its manufactured goods. China, vast, wealthy, and densely populated, seemed the perfect destination. By the mid-1800s, hundreds of foreign ships were arriving each year at Chinese ports. Britain wanted a positive trade balance, to sell more than it bought. Its diplomats proposed new treaties, open ports, and favorable conditions. The Chinese emperor refused. The empire, he believed, had no need to change for foreigners. But China also followed mercantilist ideas, trying to keep silver inside its borders. Britain responded by searching for a product China could not resist. That product was opium. Opium had long been used in China as medicine, but when Europeans introduced tobacco from the Americas, people began mixing tobacco with opium to smoke it. The addiction was devastating. In its colonies in India, Britain cultivated vast fields of opium poppies and exported the drug to China, draining Chinese silver into British coffers. In 1800, China banned opium imports. Smuggling continued anyway. Within 40 years, shipments multiplied dramatically. In 1839, Chinese officials in the port city of Guangzhou confiscated and destroyed hundreds of tons of British opium. The operation was led by Lin Zexu, who wrote a letter to Queen Victoria asking, by what right did Britain poison the Chinese people? The letter went unanswered. But Britain responded with force. Warships arrived. The First Opium War began. The technological gap was overwhelming, and China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking, paying heavy reparations and ceding Hong Kong to Britain. A second opium war followed. China lost again, and opium imports were legalized. At one point, nearly half of the exports of the British East India Company to China depended on opium. By the early 20th century, 1 in 4 Chinese men was addicted. China was not formally colonized like India, but its image of itself as the center of the world shattered. This period would later be called the Century of Humiliation. Imperial authority collapsed, internal unrest grew, and China stood on the edge of civil war, searching for a path to restore its former greatness.
By the early 20th century, the economy of China was in deep crisis. Intellectuals and military leaders demanded the overthrow of the monarchy and the creation of a republic. China could see that another path was possible. Nearby, Japan had once faced similar challenges. Yet, after the Meiji Restoration, Japan overthrew its old order and rapidly became one of the world's leading industrial powers. In China, however, reform came too slowly. Living standards barely improved, and the political elite was closely tied to foreign capital. Public anger grew, and in 1911, the Xinhai Revolution forced the last emperor to abdicate. What followed was chaos. China fragmented into rival factions and warlord territories. 2 major political forces emerged, the Chinese Communist Party and the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang. The Communists, inspired by the revolution in Russia, gained support among peasants. The Kuomintang, better organized and backed by industrial interests, became their main rival. Their struggle was interrupted in 1937 when Japan invaded China. Facing a common enemy, the 2 sides formed a fragile alliance. Nationalist armies fought head-on, while communists, guerrillas, attacked supply lines and weakened Japanese forces from within. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the Civil War resumed. Corruption weakened the nationalists, while the communists gained popularity. Their leader, Mao Zedong, built strong ties with the Soviet Union. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, aiming to transform China from an agricultural nation into an industrial superpower and even surpass Great Britain in steel production. Peasant communes were created. Backyard furnaces melted tools and household items. At the same time, a campaign against pests led to mass killings of sparrows, which caused ecological disaster and crop failures. The result was catastrophic famine. Tens of millions died. China remained poor and overwhelmingly rural. Yet Mao's personality cult remained powerful. His quotations were printed in enormous numbers, second only to the Bible and the Quran. Many citizens saw him as the leader who restored unity, expanded education, and introduced basic health care. Still, China was far from an economic powerhouse. So how did it finally change course? How did China build one of the strongest economies on Earth? To answer that question, we must meet the architect of China's economic miracle, the man who came after Mao, Deng Xiaoping.
In 1976, China's great helmsman, Mao Zedong, died. Power within the Chinese political elite passed to Deng Xiaoping, a man who, alongside Mao, had traveled the long road from revolution and civil war to the heights of party leadership. But unlike his former chief, Deng did not divide reforms into bad capitalist and good socialist. He famously said, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." In December 1978, at a plenary session of the Communist Party's Central Committee, Deng announced a new course. Blind adherence to Mao's doctrines and rigid Marxist ideology would end. Practical ideas, whatever their origin, would now be welcomed. While Deng was preparing reforms, farmers in a small village in Anhui province secretly divided their collective land into family plots. They agreed to meet the state quota, but keep any surplus for themselves. Within a year, productivity soared. Instead of punishment, the party praised their success, and in 1979, the system spread across China. If farmers met their quotas, they could sell their extra harvest on the market. Agricultural productivity rose by more than 50% within 5 years. By 1984, communes had largely disappeared, and land was leased to families. Even today, private citizens in China cannot own land outright. They can only lease it from the state. With Deng's rise, China began blending market mechanisms into a planned economy, building what became known as socialism with Chinese characteristics. As agriculture became more efficient, millions of rural workers were freed to seek new jobs. The party allowed small private businesses. Soon, Chinese cities filled with barber shops, street stalls, and family enterprises. Within 2 decades, the private sector's contribution to the economy surpassed that of state-owned enterprises. Yet China still lagged far behind Western Europe, Japan, and the United States. To catch up, it needed foreign technology. In 1978, Chinese delegations toured advanced economies, studying their industries and institutions. Deng himself traveled abroad to rebuild relations with neighbors and Western nations. Relations with the Soviet Union had deteriorated after ideological clashes and border conflicts in 1969. By the late 1970s, China turned instead toward the United States. In 1972, U.S. President Richard Nixon visited China. In 1979, Washington formally recognized the People's Republic of China. Scientific, educational, and technological exchanges soon followed. In 1984, Deng met British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher to decide the future of Hong Kong. They agreed that in 1997, Hong Kong would return to China while keeping its financial and legal systems for 50 years. One country, 2 systems. China also created special economic zones along its coast: Xiamen, Shantou, Zhuhai, and Shenzhen. With tax incentives, foreign investment, and low-cost labor, these regions grew at astonishing speed. Shenzhen's GDP, for example, rose from 196 million yuan in 1979 to more than 2.5 trillion yuan by 2019. Despite liberalization, China did not become a democracy. The Communist Party retained control. Mao remained a national symbol, still printed on Chinese banknotes. Deng understood that dismantling Mao's legacy could undermine the party itself. Reforms also brought tensions. Dual pricing systems fueled inflation. Public frustration erupted in 1989 during protests in Tiananmen Square, which were ultimately suppressed by force. In 1990, Deng launched his famous Southern Tour, urging officials to continue reforms after his retirement. His policies laid the foundation for China's rise into an economic superpower. But the story does not end there. How China became one of the world's largest economies, flooding global markets with goods and emerging as a chief rival to the United States, is a story that deserves its own chapter.
You've just heard the story of socialism with Chinese characteristics, and you might be thinking, all right, they allowed small businesses, opened their borders to investors, offered tax incentives, but many countries did the same in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Yet somehow it was China that rose to become the world's leading economy. So what is its secret? The answer lies in timing and strategy. As soon as China opened to the world, global giants like Coca-Cola and General Motors rushed into the Middle Kingdom. The opportunity was enormous, a vast consumer market that had to be captured before competitors. But here was China's strategic move. Until the mid-1980s, the only way a foreign company could operate in China was through a joint venture with a local partner. The foreign side provided capital and technology. The Chinese side handled legal registration, logistics, staffing, including senior management. And gradually, it became clear China never intended to be merely a market for foreign goods. It wanted to become the world's factory, exporting products to every corner of the planet, just as it had before the Opium Wars. Western companies entered China expecting to sell. Instead, Chinese firms carefully studied them and often replicated their technologies domestically. This was not unusual in history. The early Soviet automobile industry, for example, was heavily based on American and Italian designs. Compare the 2003 Chevrolet Spark to the 2006 Chery QQ. The similarities are striking. But China did not copy once. It systematized the process. And this extended far beyond counterfeit handbags. In 2013, the Federal Bureau of Investigation reported attempts by Chinese entities to extract genetically modified corn seeds from the United States. In 2020, Tesla accused a former employee of stealing self-driving autopilot source code and transferring it to Chinese competitors. By copying rather than inventing from scratch, China avoided spending hundreds of millions on early-stage research and leaped forward by a decade or more. At the same time, its investment in research and development grew rapidly throughout the 2000s, eventually surpassing Japan and even the European Union. State policy reinforced this trajectory. Subsidies and benefits overwhelmingly favored domestic firms, whether private or state-owned. Over the past 2 decades, foreign companies received a fraction of the support granted to Chinese enterprises. With cheap labor, imported know-how, and government backing, Chinese companies did more than produce inexpensive goods. They began acquiring foreign brands. In 2010, Geely purchased Volvo cars. In 2014, Lenovo acquired Motorola Mobility from Google. Another striking example lies in high-speed rail. In the early 2000s, China purchased train technology from Germany's Siemens and France's Alstom. For a country spanning thousands of kilometers east to west, high-speed rail was essential. By 2007, China introduced its own high-speed train. By 2015, its rail manufacturers were producing more than Siemens and Alstom's rail divisions combined. At one point, Germany's national railway operator Deutsche Bahn even considered purchasing Chinese trains because they were cheaper yet comparable in quality. Meanwhile, when Siemens and Alstom attempted to merge to compete with China, the European Union blocked the deal over monopoly concerns. Today, China's State Rail Corporation stands as the largest in the world by revenue. If the United States dominated critical technological innovation in the 2000s, China has increasingly taken that role, from electric vehicles to globally influential digital platforms. Naturally, Washington reacted. In 2016, Donald Trump imposed anti-dumping tariffs on steel and a 26% tariff on certain Chinese goods. In 2022, Joe Biden restricted imports from Chinese telecom giant Huawei. To understand American concern, look at China's GDP structure. Nearly 40% of its economy comes from manufacturing, producing goods for the entire world. Ironically, the largest consumers of Chinese exports remain the European Union and the United States themselves. The West fears China's expansion, yet depends on its low-cost production. But China faces its own dilemma. Domestic consumption accounts for only a small share of GDP, compared to 70 or even 80% in advanced economies. A truly stable economy consumes much of what it produces. China's internal demand has not grown proportionally, and in some periods it has weakened. The rivalry between China and the United States has evolved beyond a trade war. It has become a competition for influence across the developing world. Through infrastructure loans, such as port financing in Sri Lanka, China has secured long-term strategic footholds, including 99-year lease agreements when debts could not be repaid. At the same time, Beijing advances the Belt and Road Initiative, seeking to connect Eurasia and reduce reliance on routes like the Suez Canal. Yet every rise carries limits. It is easier to grow when you're catching up, benefiting from technology transfer and a low base effect. In the 2000s, China's economy expanded by more than 8% annually. Today, growth rates resemble those of the United States. Now, China must innovate independently and compete at the frontier. Demographics present another challenge. After decades as the world's most populous country, China has been overtaken by India. The legacy of the one-child policy, introduced in 1979, has accelerated population aging and created gender imbalances. Although restrictions were eased in 2015 and 2021, birth rates have not rebounded significantly. Meanwhile, rising labor costs and geopolitical tensions have prompted companies like Intel, Nike, and Microsoft to shift portions of production to countries like Bangladesh, Mexico, and Vietnam. For the first time in decades, foreign investment flows have begun moving out of China. So, the question remains, will China continue its ascent, reshaping global power? Or will its momentum slow under the weight of internal pressures and external resistance? Who will define the next era of global economic leadership? That answer may unfold within the next decade.